Okay, thank you once again for joining us and for attending our webinar, Exploring Surrogacy Options, an online information session for Norwegian intended parents. My name is Brian Manning. I'm the Communications Manager here at Circle Surrogacy. On tonight's panel, we have a little bit of a technical difficulty right now. Brett Griffin-Young is supposed to be joining us from the UK, but he's having some issues logging in, so we're going to work on that, but we'll also have Dean Hutchison, who's the Director of Legal Services here at Circle Surrogacy, as well as an experienced parent through surrogacy from Norway will be joining us later on. Just an overview of what we'll be covering today. We'll start with some Circle Surrogacy history and background. We'll go over the differences between gestational surrogacy and GSED, or gestational surrogacy with egg donation. We'll talk a little bit about the surrogacy process in general and explain our different program options. We'll cover the legal work for Norwegian intended parents. We'll discuss cost and insurance. And as I mentioned, we'll hear from Christian, who is an experienced Norwegian parent through surrogacy. Before we get started, a bit of housekeeping. You can listen into this webinar by phone or by using your computer speakers. You should know that you're on mute, so we can't hear you. But if you have any questions during the course of the webinar, you can type those into the questions panel, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. We're also going to be recording the webinar, and we'll email it to you afterwards. So since Brett isn't able to join us, I'm going to have Dean go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining. So as Brian said, I'm the Director of Legal Services here at Circle. And although I usually do the legal portion, I've been with Circle for 12 years now and have pretty good experience in both sides of the process. Just to give you a quick background on myself before I get into the actual presentation, I started with Circle Surrogacy approximately 12 years ago as a law clerk. Right out of law school, I started as a law clerk for both Circle Surrogacy as well as John Weltman, our president's private legal practice. I spent about a year in that position doing many of the things I still do today, helping with contracts, helping with heritage right legal work. And then I took a position in the law firm that Circle used to be located inside of for the following 6 years. About 5 years ago now, Circle had just grown too big, had expanded, and needed a separate space to separate itself from that law firm, and we moved to where we are now in Boston, and I followed inside of that first year with a position inside the legal department. What I mainly do now is kind of manage people's journeys from start to finish, from matching you, from helping with contracts to establishing your legal work. So a little bit about Circle. Circle Surrogacy, we're located in Boston, but we have surrogates all around the country, and clients all around the world. We're probably one of the oldest and largest surrogacy agencies in the world, going on 19 years now. Some are close to probably 950 children born as a result of our assistance. Our president, John Weltman, he's the president and founder of Circle. He's a parent twice through surrogacy of a 19 and 20-year-old boys. He started in this area prior to his children being born. He had represented clients in a surrogacy matter in, I believe, 1992, and then has probably been one of the most forefront people on assisted reproduction law, as well as surrogacy and gay parenting. As I said earlier, he founded Circle in 1995, and he himself and his husband, Cliff, are parents through surrogacy. So the first is, why would you choose Circle Surrogacy over, the other agencies in the U.S. really and the world? So first, we have a nearly 100% success rate, and why we say nearly is it's pretty much 100% for everyone who decides to do surrogacy with egg donation or is willing to switch to egg donation at some point if they're trying with their own biology first. And with the doctors we've worked with, we've never had a client walk away from the program without a child. when they've listened to advice of both the doctors as well as Circle. With our connections with a couple different agencies or IVF clinics in the U.S., we have the ability to offer unlimited IVF programs. So for one set cost, the doctors we work with will continue to create embryos and do as many transfers as it takes for you to walk away with a live child. Not very common with IVF clinics, but we've been able to successfully create these relationships to allow clients to have that benefit. Ourselves as an agency, as part of our agency fee, there's an unlimited matching of both surrogates and donors. And what I mean by this is if you were to get matched with a surrogate and have a couple transfers and be unsuccessful and for some medical reason need a new surrogate, you wouldn't pay any additional costs to Circle to find a new surrogate or donor. You wouldn't pay costs to draft the contracts. You wouldn't have to cover the costs of the surrogate or the donor's attorney as well as some of the third-party psychosocial analysis, psychologist exams, and criminal background checks. It's all included in the first time you pay. Circle also has a vast international expertise in this area of law, as well as working with intended parents from all over the world, specifically with Norway. Probably about a little over 60% of our client base is international. So we've got very much great experience with clients from all over the world. And as I said, probably at least a dozen or more children born in Norway, and many pregnant at the moment. We take intended parents from all backgrounds, whether you're single, straight, heterosexual couple, or a same-sex couple. We've worked with all different clients, and we have experience in all of them. We also work in what's called the SPAR program. This is a program used for HIV positive intended parents, working with a very big research hospital in Boston who's developed a way to clean sperm and make sure that all embryos are devoid of any trace of HIV. Clients can work in that program and still have children through IVF. Circle has an emphasis on known egg donation. We don't require it, but we advise it for many different reasons, but mainly when our main focus is not just the intended parents, but the children to be born through the process. And you see it more and more in today's news that children born through adoption or children from adoption or born through IVF all want to find out where they came from and what their genetic code is. So we advise this for many reasons. One, for the child's well-being, and also from a medical perspective. If you have that ability to go back to your donor, whether it's semi-known or known, to ask, or your donor gets some medical condition you weren't aware of when you originally saw their notes, that you can always be informed and be on the lookout. We also stress a relationship-based with your surrogate and your donor, mainly with your surrogate. We want to make sure this isn't just a, couple calls here and there, and then once the baby's born, you have no more contact with your surrogate. We're hoping that a relationship forms between the two of you that, even after the baby's born, there's some type of contact remaining, whether it be Christmas cards or things like that. We also have very strong support system throughout the process for both our intended parents and the surrogate. There's an intended parent support team here now that will reach out to you from the day you sign on through your whole journey. If you're having any issues with any part of your journey, there's a social work support team here for you. I just got a question. Is it a requirement to be Norwegian? I'm not sure if it means specifically to be on this webinar or in general. There's no requirements. I'll focus a little on Norwegian law, but I'm going to give more of a general overview of the whole process. And if you're living in Norway, there's no necessity that you don't have to be a Norwegian citizen to do surrogacy. You can still get the citizenship of your home country, and we'd make sure that from an immigration perspective you can get back with no issue. So the three main components of a successful surrogacy journey, one is communication, and that is not only Circle keeping up communications with you, so you're always informed, and you keeping up with Circle and keeping us informed of any changes, but also strong communication between you and your surrogate. making sure there's kind of weekly check-ins, whether it's email or Skype or FaceTime. With today's technology, it's very simple to keep that contact going. And it's much different 5-10 years ago when it was only phone calls, but now you have that ability to kind of see each other when you're talking. So very, very important to keep that communication throughout the whole process. Second is trust, and what we mean by that is, obviously I think 2 and 3 go together in that you're 3,000 plus miles away from your surrogate. Very hard to have a 24/7 monitoring, but what you really have to do from day one is kind of let go of control and kind of put that trust to us as Circle as being experts in the program, but also to your surrogate. She's going to have at least one child with no complications in the past. She's gone through a pregnancy on her own. She understands what she's doing, and we're going to keep in contact with her, and we're going to help coordinate all trips and travel for IVF, et cetera. But it's very hard as an intended parent if you're always nervous and you're always thinking about what might happen or what not. But the second you do let go of that, kind of let go of the control and the trust, the more positive your journey will be. So there's mainly 2 programs available. What's called, one is gestational surrogacy, one is gestational surrogacy with egg donation. Obvious difference between the 2 is gestational surrogacy, you're only using Circle to find you a surrogate to carry your child, whether you already have embryos frozen somewhere or you're going to create embryos with your own genetics here in the U.S. So what we do there is just simply would be looking to find you a surrogate that meets all your legal and other requirements. Gestational surrogacy with egg donation, obviously the difference is we're going to also help you find an egg donor that fits everything you need. So we've gotten a couple questions and I answered one of them. I just want to let everyone know, don't feel like I'm avoiding your questions. If you do ask me a question, we will answer all of them at the end in a row. So don't feel like we're not getting to it. We'll make sure we hit these questions at the end. So the surrogacy process, very simply broken down, it starts with a consultation. So let's say after today you want to learn more about the process, more in depth about your specific situation, and you're probably within a year of making that decision to do surrogacy. We offer free consultations anywhere from 2 to 3 hours long where you meet with both a social work representative from Circle as well as a legal team representative. We go over in more detail the specific process of the journey as well as the specific legal needs and insurance, et cetera. If after that consultation you're ready to proceed and you want to work with Circle, you would sign the agreement for services, send payment, and you would get welcomed. First, you'd get welcomed by the team who did the consultation with you, and then immediately the program coordination team. So at Circle, you'll be assigned a program coordination team. One person will be your main contact, but there's 3 people working together who kind of handle all the day-to-day details of your journey, helping with travel, helping with getting payments out to surrogates, things like that. So they'll reach out to you, set up a time to have a Skype to introduce themselves to you, as well as get some more information from you. There's some forms you'll have to fill out, some other issues to just make sure that they're fully clear on. Also, the intended parent support team will reach out to you near immediate to introduce themselves, so you know that there's this team here for you if and when you're having issues during your journey or you just have specific questions that are more geared towards that social work side. Next, if needed, if you haven't chosen an IVF clinic yet, we would help you kind of go through the different clinics available that we work with mostly that have these different package programs available, because we want to make sure that clinic is in place first so that when you pick an egg donor and you pick a surrogate, your clinic is there to give kind of medical, to medically approve them to go forward in the process. Next, after your clinic is chosen, again, if needed and you need an egg donor, whether you're a same-sex couple or a hetero couple that needs egg donation, we would help you choose a donor. So at Circle, we have a separate egg donor agency, Circle Egg Donation. There's roughly about 340 donors available on the site at any time, but we also have relationships with 3 national donor agencies that if you don't find someone specific to your liking on our site, we can introduce you to the egg donation agencies that we work with many times. Next is surrogate matching. I'll go through it a little more in depth when I get to each individual stage, but we're finding surrogates, screening them that work specifically with whatever your requirements are. And then finally is the whole journey program coordination, and that is kind of once you're matched with the surrogate, your coordinator's taking over and doing all the day-to-day travel, etc. So as I said, the program coordination, you'll get this initial welcome from your program coordination team. They'll send an email and set up a Skype. They'll do the same for the gestational surrogate and the donor when they're chosen by you. They're going to be that coordinator that connects all the various parties and makes sure, working directly with the clinics to make sure all medication protocols are in place and travel is specifically set up. They're going to work to make sure insurance is set up, the different insurances that are needed, as well as legal is working to make sure the legal action is taking place to get your parentage rights. They're going to help also in making sure, on a monthly basis or when any miscellaneous fees come in from both the surrogate and the donor, that payments are being made from the trust account that are approved, et cetera. And then their kind of main purpose at the end, anywhere from about 4 to 6 weeks from the due date, is they do a hospital preparation with the hospital where the surrogate's going to deliver to make sure there's a kind of a process in place that whether you're doing legal work pre or post, that the hospital knows it's a surrogacy, that if available, they'll make rooms available to you, that they'll give you the certain bands at the hospital that give you rights into the nursery. So they'll set this up in advance so that it's not a surprise to the hospital. We'll also do a 30-week call, the program coordinator, with the intended parents, as well as someone from the legal department, just to make sure everyone's on top of how the legal work is going to be completed and what the process is in the end at the hospital and after the hospital. So now I'll talk a little bit about our surrogates and the surrogate matching process. So we have very high standards. On a monthly basis, we get anywhere upwards of 1,500 applicants that come to our website to begin the application process. Of that 1,500 that finally make it to be surrogates, maybe 1 to 2% make it through. It's a very thorough analysis. There's a long questionnaire that tends to cut a big percentage out. They then have to get a lot of documentation together. They have to go through psychosocial screening of not only the surrogate, but also her significant other or whoever her support person is going to be in the program. There's medical checks. There's background checks. There is criminal history checks. And there's also legal checks. So, some of our highlighted requirements, we have certain BMI, body mass index requirements based upon what the clinic guidelines are. So whichever IVF clinic you're working with, we've kind of based our own internal BMI guidelines on what our different IVF clinics want. The surrogate herself will be between 21 and 41 years of age. Some clinics IVF clinics allow for a little older than 41, but we always keep it in that 21 to 41 range. As I said earlier, they've had to have given birth to a healthy child with no complications. And if they've had more than one child, the most recent birth had to have been non-complicated and child healthy. They go through psychological screening with a social worker. They also go through a psychologist exam called an MMPI exam here in the United States with a licensed psychologist. Their medical records are reviewed in-house as well as sent to your specific IVF clinic to make sure they're okay with working with you. And they must, from a legal perspective as well as sociological perspective, live in a state that's surrogate friendly. So there's no laws against surrogacy and there's no issues specifically in their community as well. They must have support of family and friends. So we don't want, a single woman with no friends or family in her area being a surrogate. So because we want there to be someone to help her with child care, to get her to doctor's appointments if need be, or someone just to talk to. And obviously they're not allowed to use illegal drugs, smoke cigarettes, or abuse alcohol. Now I'll talk a little bit about the egg donors. So it's very similar. There's certain requirements for donors. They have to be between 20 and 29 years of age. Body mass index no higher than 28 to 30. A healthy family history. They give kind of the whole background of all different relatives and what their medical history is. no use of illegal drugs or cigarettes or alcohol abuse, and a minimum of a high school degree. As I said earlier, we have roughly 340, 350 donors active at any time on our donor database. Choosing a donor, even before you have a consult, if you're bored one day and you want to look at our webpage, you can go directly to our webpage. There's a click on the kind of egg donor page, and you can go right into the database simply by supplying an email address, and you can make up a password. You can search the database, as you see above, for many different things: height, weight, eye color, age, education, etc. And you can review the entire database to see in advance, if there's certain donors that appeal to you. Very simple process. You can also, when you work with Circle directly and you kind of have a specific type donor in mind, work directly with our egg donation coordinator, and she'll has a pretty good understanding of our whole database and can point you towards certain donors she thinks would work for you. So there's 3 different types of egg donation usually. The first one, what Circle tends to advise upon, is known donation. And that is where you know everything about the donor, including name and where she's from. Can actually meet in person if you'd like, or have a Skype. You'll all have contact information. And when you have a known donor as well as a surrogate, it doesn't mean that after the fact, if you don't want constant contact with them, they have the ability to reach out to you at all times. The way your contract's going to be drafted with both the donor and the surrogate is you have the ability to reach back to them, but you kind of guide that relationship. So it's still your control, how much contact there is and how much knowledge there is. But as I said earlier, from a known perspective, why we advise it is for your child's own well-being, just so if they start asking that question later in life about who they are and where they came from, you have the ability to answer, and you have the ability to get in touch with the person if you'd like. Also, from a medical perspective, if something happens with the child, some rare issue, and you want to get in touch with the donor, you can, or if the donor develops some type of medical issue later in life that's hereditary, that no one in her family presented prior, you can reach out to her as well. There's also semi-known donation, very similar, but you just learn the surrogates or the donor's first name, and you'll have the ability to have a Skype or a telephone clinic, but you'll never know the other identifying information like her last name and where she lives, etc. And then there's just straight anonymous donation, where you don't know anything except for the basic facts about the donor, her medical history, and different background information that you want, but you won't know her name, and you'll never get the chance to speak to her or know her. Again, while we advise known donation, you can make the choice of any of the different types of relationships you want with the donor. So this is not my story. This is Brett's story, who was going to initially talk to you. Just so you know a little bit about Brett. Brett is located in Nottingham in the UK. He's our European outreach associate. He's a parent through Circle as well as through adoption. Usually he does a lot of our trips abroad when we meet, do consultations in these group meetings in Norway, in Sweden, and the UK. So if you were to have a live consultation or even a Skype, it'd probably be with Brett and most likely myself. And Brett is in a much closer time zone to you as well. So during journeys, whether we have intended parents from Sweden, Norway, the UK, that will reach out to him with specific questions sometimes about his experience, his travel, as well as just the fact that he's going to have a different time zone than us, and it's easier to get in touch with him in the morning while the lights haven't been turned on here yet. So now I'll talk about kind of the legal aspects of surrogacy, both from a U.S. perspective and a little bit on the Norwegian perspective. So at Circle, the process teams, I didn't go over them briefly, but you have this program coordination teams, you have social work teams, you have surrogate screening teams, but we also have a full legal team here at Circle. We have 8 licensed attorneys on staff. Myself, Scott, and John Weltman, our president, we've all been involved in Circle our entire careers pretty much. But on top of that, Gina Marie, who does our contract drafting and negotiating, she's been with Circle since her first day of law school. 7 years now since that date. She does a lot of the contract drafting and negotiating with donors and carriers. We have my former law clerk, now attorney here, Jessica, has been with Circle since her first day of law school 4 years ago. She helps a lot with the parentage aspects at the end, doing the legal work. We have a law clerk who's actually a licensed attorney, Rona, who helps with all different areas, mainly with contracts, but also with some court proceedings. And then a woman of counsel who lives in New York. She's a partner at the firm we used to work at, but she more experienced in insurance issues. So if an insurance issue comes up, that's when we work with. So we have well over 50 years of combined experience in this area of law, and nearly everyone in the 8-person legal department has spent either all or the overwhelming majority of their careers in this field. We all attend national, international conferences on these topics and have relationships with attorneys throughout the country as well as throughout the world. When we're dealing with surrogacy, the law that is most important is the law where the surrogate will deliver the child. That's the law that will have all the power as to parentage rights as well as birth certificate issues. So, even if your surrogate lives in state 1, if she's going to deliver in state 2, we'll make sure legally both states work, but the more important one is going to be the one where the child is actually delivered. There's only 6 places we don't take surrogates from because of legal issues, and that is Washington State, Washington, D.C., Nebraska, Michigan, New York, and New Jersey, and that is mainly because there's either statutory laws in those states that prohibit surrogacy, or there is bad historical case law that has either given surrogates rights or found surrogate contracts to be against public policy or something like that. The intended parent's home country is also going to be important because obviously we want to make sure we're matching with the specific requirements to what's needed in Norway. And also potentially the IVF center location can apply in some instances, mainly if you work with a California IVF clinic. We can do legal work in California no matter where you're from or no matter where the surrogate's from, because California, in their surrogacy statute, has given itself jurisdiction over, as long as any portion of the proceeding happens in California, California can make a parentage decision. So from a Norway perspective, there's no real law on the books, but there's processes to be followed, and the government has made it they haven't made it simple, but they've made an actual kind of process for Norwegian couples and Norwegian singles to follow when returning home. It's pretty recent, a couple of years old, and it's changed, I know, as of January 2014, and I think it's ongoing change, but for the most part, it used to be for same-sex couples to put the biological father and the surrogate on the birth certificate and then either get biological father alone or terminate her rights. What I've heard recently is the birth certificate itself doesn't really matter. Heterosexual couples, same, you're really supposed to, even if you both go on the birth certificate, declare it's a surrogacy, and the second parent can always get rights in Norway through a close parent adoption. There is an extra step required for Norway, which most countries don't require. Recently, at least, is to go to the U.S. consulate that's in charge of the state where your delivery occurs, and to actually the biological parent to do a DNA test, and that kind of starts the process for you to register the child upon return. I still think you can return home without doing that. It just makes it a much easier, simpler process if you start here in the U.S. and then go home and continue the process. Christian can speak more directly to his experience, but speaking with a couple intended parents who've recently returned home, the process isn't hard. It's more of getting someone at the government authorities just to get on the ball and to do the things they're asking them to do. So it hasn't been very tough. They've actually been pretty receptive to U.S. surrogacy and made it simple. You don't have to wait for like a Norwegian passport or anything to return home or a Norwegian visa. You can travel home on a U.S. passport. So for each client that comes to us, intended parents, whether they're single, married, same-sex, we're going to make sure we have a specific individual legal plan that's specific to your needs. So we'll create a legal plan right at the outset. If you have an attorney involved in Norway, we'll obviously interact with them. Most don't use attorneys, but we have a couple we can clients have worked with in the past that we can put you in touch with. So we have three main goals in this process. Just so you know, Circle is representing you from the day you sign with us as your legal representatives. Our attorneys are your attorneys, so we're going to represent you throughout this process. Our main goals, number one, are securing your parental rights. It's obviously the most important part of a surrogacy journey. So we want to make sure both from a U.S. and a Norwegian perspective you're fully protected. That's done through properly matching you with a surrogate where the state law is fine. Properly negotiating and drafting your contract with both the donor and carrier to fully protect you, and then managing that legal work at the end here in the U.S. to fully make sure every right that needs to be terminated is terminated and your rights are fully secure. The second main goal in the process is to make the pregnancy your pregnancy, and what we mean by this is even though the surrogate is carrying the child and she's X amount of miles away, that your contract with her gives you all these medical decision rights throughout the process, that if there's an issue, you're going to be fully informed by the doctors and you're going to be able to make certain medical decision rights, not only during the pregnancy, but immediately upon birth. And then the final kind of goal is to what we say limit your liabilities in the process. And that's not to make you think some huge lawsuit is heading your way. It's more that every surrogate's going to have certain demands in the contract. And we just want to make sure when we're negotiating the contract that we advise you of what we think is ordinary and customary in the practice versus what's completely out of bounds and we think you're subjecting yourself to higher liability than you should be. So there's three main legal stages in this process. The first is the matching stage, and that is when we're matching you with a surrogate. So as I said earlier, she goes through this very thorough screening process. Once she's kind of fully screened and vetted and everything looks okay, the next phase is legal, and we're making sure that, say a same-sex Norwegian couple can work with a married surrogate in Florida. I've done this for 12 years now. I have pretty good understanding on which states work with which countries, but I still make sure I reach out to my local attorneys in the different states to make sure nothing's changed and we can accomplish what we need to accomplish in that state that won't have any issue or bearing on what you need from a Norwegian perspective. Stage two is the contracts. Whether you have a donor and a carrier or just a carrier, you're going to have a contract with each. We're going to draft everything on your behalf and negotiate on your behalf. We do everything here first, set up a time to go over it with you, and then it goes to a attorney who represents the donor and the surrogate. They're going to have independent counsel outside of Circle representing them, but pretty simple process, not a lot of back and forth in the negotiation process. Final is the legal work stage here in the U.S., and what that is just assisting with the legal work to establish your parentage rights from a U.S. perspective. Sometimes this can be done pre-birth, sometimes post-birth. It depends on a lot of things from whatever your specific needs are, and whatever state you're in is going to have a certain set of laws. In the U.S., as you probably know, but if you don't, all 50 states have different sets of laws and different requirements in all different areas, including surrogacy. So there's no real there's no legal process that's specific to the country. It's going to be specific to the actual state you're matching. So as I said earlier, we have lots of different program options here. We have this unlimited IVF plan where not only is your matching with donors and carriers unlimited, but also your IVF process, so your creation of embryos and transfers to surrogates are unlimited for certain fees. We have gestational surrogacy as well as gestational surrogacy with an egg donor. We also have gestational surrogacy when you're bringing your own egg donor. We have some of the clinics we work with have frozen eggs available, like a frozen egg bank program. And then we also just do Circle egg donation if you only need an egg donor. I will say one thing, the question comes up a lot from an international perspective, that if you have made embryos abroad, can you bring them to the U.S.? So technically, no, under our Federal Drug Administration guidelines, you cannot. However, there are some exemptions, and one of those is specifically for heterosexual couples. If you have created embryos abroad for your own use, so whether you made them with a donor or made them with both your egg and sperm, you can sometimes get an exemption to ship those embryos to the U.S. and use with a U.S. surrogate. The only requirement will be certain blood tests done when you get to the U.S., but it has been possible. So the caveat to that is you have to speak directly to the clinic you're using. Some clinics in Europe will not ship to the U.S. or won't ship anywhere. It'll just be, you'll have to review your contract with them. Some put it in the contract that you're not allowed to ship. Some just won't ship outside of the home country. But we've definitely had intended parents have success sending embryos from abroad that they initially had chosen or created to make themselves. So the cost, very tough to go over in a kind of general setting. Each one's going to be specific to your needs, but as we put here, costs range from about $65,000 to $100,000, not including IVF, medical, and insurance. From a GSED standpoint, so gestational surrogacy with egg donation, average cost roughly $150,000. GS only, where you're not using an egg donor, probably more like $125,000. You can go to our website. The link is right there on the screen if you want to take it down, but you can also just go and just look for the cost button, and based on your own specific needs, you can get a rundown of what the cost would look like. Insurance. So probably one of the most foreign things to our international clients is U.S. insurance, because it is nothing like you have in Norway. We have a private system. So the way it works is it's going to be, you're either going to work with a surrogate who has her own insurance that covers her maternity and sometimes even covers children born to her, or you're going to work with a surrogate where you purchase an insurance product for her. There's different insurance products out there you can purchase, but again, this is going to be very specific to your needs. Better to go over in a consult, but depending on which program you're in, standard or fast, or if you're trying for twins or singletons, is going to be a differential on what type of insurance you use. There's a small complications insurance everyone buys for both the carrier and the donor. It's $200 to $300 depending if you have both, that just covers any complications from the IVF process. There's also a requirement to purchase life insurance for the surrogate. It's very inexpensive. It's about $400 to $600 depending on the plan you choose. And what that does is, in case the surrogate were to pass away at any time during the pregnancy, it would have a payout to both her family as well as to the intended parents for any monies lost in the process. In 19 years and 950 some odd children, like I said earlier, it's never been needed. However, it's just there to protect everyone involved, not only the intended parents, but the surrogate and her family as well. So last, as I said earlier, if after today you want a consultation, we offer free consultations. They last about 2.5 hours. They can be done by Skype, sometimes phone, or sometimes in person as well. People sometimes come to the office, or we're, I think, scheduled to be in Norway either in May or June. It hasn't been finalized yet, but we're usually there at least once, if not twice a year, for in-person group meetings and consultations. I believe, I think it's May or June. I'm not sure, but you can just check our website and we'll keep updating on when we'll be there. Usually in Oslo, but we've gone up to Trondheim as well. As I said earlier, there's a social work and legal perspective, and they'll talk to you about the social work perspective. We'll talk to you about the process more in depth, as well as why you want to be a parent through surrogacy, et cetera. And then the legal part, I'll be more in depth on insurance, costs, fees, and the different legal work involved. And it gives you a chance to ask questions in a more private setting. For more information, the website is right there, circlesurrogacy.com. And if you want to speak to Bruce and maybe schedule a consultation, his contact is on the screen. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Brian, who's going to hand it over to Christian. But again, feel free to type in any questions you have on the right, and we'll get to them right after Christian completes his portion.
Thanks, Dean. Christian, are you there?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. So, like we said earlier, Christian is an experienced parent through Circle Surrogacy from Norway, and he's going to give us, he's been generous enough to agree to give a little bit of background about his story. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to him for a few minutes, and then we'll come back at the end to answer questions. Thanks, Christian.
Yeah, okay. How long do you want to talk for?
Like 5 or 10
What's the
minutes
time
would
frame?
be great.
Okay. So I guess I'll do my talking in Norwegian, probably. Okay?
Great. And you can speak in Norwegian if you'd like to, or English, either one.
Okay. Yes. Dette vanskelig å snakke til noen som ikke ser, men kort fortalt, vi et par bosatt I Trondheim, fikk 2 barn gjennom en avtale med Surrogacy I 2011. Kortversjonen at det var mange spørsmål og mye undring og fascinasjon over at noen faktisk vil utsette seg for å være høy på andre vegne. Vi hadde mange spørsmål knyttet til forsikring, for eksempel. Vi hadde mange spørsmål knyttet til hva den kommer her til å koste. Ser vi tilbake på det nå, så vil jeg vel påstå at vi hadde en reise som var fullstendig begivenhetsløs I betydningen det skjedde egentlig ingenting som var uforutsett eller problematisk, det får ikke det store bildet. Så sånn sett så vil jeg jo på en måte påstå at vår situasjon var relativt lett og støtt, både juridisk og praktisk fra Surrogacy. Sånn sett så kan vi si at det hadde vært litt interessant for dere fra noen som hadde flere problemer enn vi hadde. Det jeg kan si 2 ord om, vi deler det grovt sett I 3 da. Så det den perioden som før man bestemmer seg og kontraktuelt blir enige om at det her går vi for, og putter masse penger inn I prosessen. Det vi gjorde aller først, det var at vi begynte vi rett og slett søkte masse rundt på nettet. Vi prøvde å komme I kontakt med folk som hadde prøvd å bli foreldre eller blitt foreldre. I 2009-2010, jeg ikke akkurat når det men vi bestemte oss først for å reise til USA. Vi dro først til østkysten og besøkte flere byråer, inkludert Surrogacy. Vi reiste over til vestkysten og besøkte flere firmaer der. Vi snakket med folk, rett og slett. Satte oss ned, så dem I øynene og måtte hørt på hvordan de resonerte. Vi gjorde det samme, vi dro til Canada. Og grunnen til at vi endte opp med Surrogacy etter den prosessen, det var egentlig 2 ting. De var de eneste som jeg opplevde som ga et troverdig svar på hvordan I all verden forsikrer det så at du ikke blir sittende med en kjempestor regning hvis noen ting går galt. Og det andre at de var det byrået på det tidspunktet, nå vet jeg ikke hvordan det I dag, som hadde en relativt helhetlig tilnærming. Det vi ikke hadde lyst til, det var å sitte I Norge og administrere grensesnittet mellom surrogater, donorer, klinikker, advokater, sykehus og så videre. Vi ville på en måte vite at noen kunne ta seg av alle de overgangene og stille de riktige spørsmål. Uten å gå langt inne, så som norsk så virker det I hvert fall på det tidspunktet vi startet. Så det veldig rart at noen har lyst til å utsatt seg for surrogati. Så vi dro på en måte over til USA med en undring. Hvordan på en måte tenker de her damene? Man har jo hørt sitt om anklager om menneskehandel og at man utnytter folk som ikke vet sitt eget beste og så videre. Uten at jeg kan ta stilling til at det ikke skjer I noen tilfeller. Så det var vår opplevelse at for det første at USA kulturelt veldig forskjellig fra oss. Hvis vi tar vår egen surrogat spesielt, så det et lesbisk par. De har selv fått hjelp til å få barn, og hadde rett og slett bestemt seg for at når de hadde fått hjelp, så var det bare rett og rimelig at de hjalp sin neste. Så det var litt overraskende logikk, da. Mulig jeg kanskje kynisk, men litt annerledes fra hvordan jeg ville ha tenkt. Der var relativt ressurssterke folk. Partneren var forlegger i et selskap som hadde åpenbart ingen økonomiske behov for å sette seg i en situasjon hvor man strengt tatt får ganske dårlig betalt for å være gravid. Vi følte oss da vi kom tilbake veldig beroliget på at det her var folk som rett og slett tenkte, eller ikke bare hadde de gjort det, men var særdeles selvbevisst på at de definitivt ikke var utsatt for en eller annen form for kynisk manipulasjon. Noen av dem var rett og slett direkte provosert over en del av denne diskusjonen som går som på en måte vi tar fra surrogatene sin egen evne til å tenke selv. Det er fullstendig ubevisst. Vi endte som sagt opp med Circle, basert på en positiv følelse av at de både kunne ivareta en helhet, og at de hadde en juridisk kompetanse som gjorde at hvis det skulle skje noe, så var vi tross alt relativt greit ivaretatt som kunder. Den andre delen er den som starter det du posisjonerer kontrakten, hvor du da egentlig begynner litt med å, for å være veldig stygg og direkte, se i en kvegkatalog. Det er kanskje det beste ordet. Men det er en rar opplevelse. Det er kanskje så vanlig når du skal bli foreldre, at du skal sitte og tenke gjennom hvordan partneren din ser ut, eller hvilken sykdomshistorikk vedkommende har. Plutselig så sitter du i en situasjon hvor du skal ta masse valg som man normalt er helt avskåret fra å ta, fordi man lever som regel sammen med den man er sammen med. For oss gikk det veldig, det var ikke noe vi brukte masse tid på. Vi bare lett etter noen som så ut som noen var sunn og frisk, og som så helt greit ut. Det er ikke så veldig noen som er stygg heller. Men som samtidig lignet på oss. Det ikke var noe. Det bare skulle ikke se ut som man kom fra to forskjellige univers. Det var så viktig for oss. Og at man hadde relativt sunne verdier. Vi hadde ikke noe kontakt med den donoren, men vi var veldig opptatt av at den relasjonen som ble etablert juridisk, åpnet for at det var full mulighet for barna på et eller annet tidspunkt å ta kontakt hvis de ønsker. Det har liksom vært et prinsipp hele veien. Kontraktuelt størst mulig grad av åpenhet, så ikke vi tar noen valg, som vi ikke må ta i hvert fall, der vi avskjær muligheter for den senere i livet. Surrogaten var en litt lengre prosess på. Der ble vi tatt i kontakt med flere før vi egentlig landet på den personen vi landet på. Grunnen til at vi blant annet sa nei til noen, det var at vi ikke rett og slett hadde tillit til at de visste hva han gjorde. De legger jo selv i stor vekt på at man bruker ganske mye tid på screeningen. Det første paret vi ble forespeilet, det var et par med relativt lav utdanning. De hadde vært gift et år, de hadde ikke noe barn. Men vi tenkte at når det i begynnelsen av 20-årene har vært gift et år, så tror jeg at de færreste har erfart nok til å ta inn over seg hva det vil si å bli foreldre for noen andre. I hvert fall var det nok resten av vi hadde is i magen og ventet. Så vi fant til slutt Annelies, som er navnet på vår surrogat, og vi hadde full tillit til. Og da reiste vi rett og slett tilbake til USA og traff dem. Vi gjorde det flere ganger. Vi bodde ikke hos dem, men vi leide leiligheten her i veien og ble godt kjent. Yes. I vårt tilfelle så gikk de praktiske tingene helt på skinnene. Det var ingen medisinske problemer. Overføringen gikk greit. Hun ble gravid på første forsøket. Vi ønsket tvillinger. Vi fikk tvillinger på første forsøket. Det var ingen stort sett komplikasjoner overhodet under fødselen. fødselen foregikk på en klinikk I Vermont. Den var de beste klinikkene I USA for å ta imot barn. Imponerende helsevesen. Helt dyrt, vil jeg tro. Ikke noe som de får noe til, på grunn av forsikringen var ivaretatt gjennom surrogaten. Og vi hadde rett og slett ingen problemer med selve den biologiske delen. Når vi begynte å nærme oss fødselen, så reiste vi tilbake til USA. Vi dro cirka en måned før termin, og så var vi her og hadde på en måte beregnet og skulle være her I 3 til 4 uker etterpå. Så gikk det også. Det var jo relativt hektisk. Det var bare så vidt vi nådde flyet på grunn av at vi begynte på plass og sånt. Men til slutt så ordnet det seg. Vår tenking om å høre at det gir litt forskjellige råd I forhold til hva vi fikk da, det var at hvis vi ikke må stille spørsmål til norske eller andre myndigheter, så lar vi heller være til vi kommer hjem. Så vi satt oss rett og slett bare på flyet etter 3 uker, så snart vi hadde fått passene til barna. Det var ingen som slutt nå I USA, via Arlanda. Der tok vi babyene og bare putt dem på ryggen, og der var det tror jeg ingen som så at vi hadde noen barn heller, så der var det heller ingen som sjekket passene. Da vi kom tilbake til Norge, så var det første vi gjorde, det var en start prosessen med å få norsk statsborgerskap. Det var litt vekk nå, men alt I alt gikk det også veldig, veldig fort. Det som tok litt lengre tid, det var den prosessen med stebarnsadopsjon, rett og slett fordi at på det tidspunktet så var det ingen som vi klarte å finne ut I Trondheim I hvert fall, som hadde prøvd på det samme. Så Nav måtte man rett og slett lage en sånn studiesirkel for å finne ut hvordan verden vi løser det her. Skjemaene våre passer ikke helt med virkeligheten. Men der også opplevde vi at det tross alt litt prat rundt det. At til tilsynelatende mye støy. Så var de myndighetene vi traff usedvanlig imøtekommende. Gikk faktisk veldig, veldig langt I å gjøre ting og typen å overføre hele permisjonen til mor, til tross for at det ikke var noe mor inne I bildet I tradisjonell forstand til oss, så at vi hadde på en måte heller ingen tap da. Bare tvert imot av fødselspermisjon. Jeg husker at ikke noe hvor lang tid det tok på denne prosessen fra vi kom hjem og til de både hadde norsk statsborgerskap og stebarnsadopsjonen var gjennomført. Men det var litt mett med det. Samtidig så var det rett og slett stort sett bare å prate med folk til og vent. Den tida det tok. I guess that's a brief overview, so I suppose if people have questions, they can just type them in and we'll try to...
Yeah, thank you. I didn't get to the second slide. I don't know if you covered the second slide here, but...
Well, I did.
Okay.
I can't see the images right now, so I'm not sure what they saw.
Okay, fair enough. Gotcha.
So, the one point I didn't mention, which is probably obvious, and this is one of the sort of more unique sides of doing surrogacy. During our sort of travels in the US, we met up with lots of people, different agencies. One of the agencies where we met up was run by psychiatrists. And we ended up having all these interesting discussions on parenthood, and I think one of the more, sort of, in hindsight, obvious remarks he made was how some people sometimes make the mistake of believing that a relationship somehow is strengthened through having children. So basically, my last point was just to say that even though it's great having kids, you should really feel comfortable within the relationship if you're a couple before you set out on this journey, because it's, even in our case, we didn't have very many issues along the way, but it's financially and practically and in many other ways, it's kind of straining in a relationship. And of course, having the kids next is also kind of a strain. I mean, permanent sleep deprivation, at least in our case. So I think in a phase where you tend to focus a lot on insurance, on biology, on finding the perfect match with a donor and a surrogate, you should also sort of stop and really think about how great your life is now and in what ways your life will change just during the process and afterwards. And honestly, if I'd been on my own, I wouldn't have gone through this. I met a partner almost 20 years ago, and he's been talking about kids for 20 years. And I kind of ignored him for like 10 years before we started engaging seriously on the topic. So in our case, we spent a lot of time basically trying to figure out, is our life going to be better with kids? Do we want to sort of take on the financial burden and give up many of the privileges we've had so far for a life with kids? And I guess even with all the time we spent, that's probably one of the points I would stress now looking back.
Great. That's very good advice. Thank you for sharing your experience. Like we said earlier, we will now take some questions. If you have a question that you've already typed in, we'll get to it. If you have a question now, you can go ahead and enter it into that question pane to the right. We'll just ask that you do so in English if possible, so Dean and I can read them. So we'll go ahead and start with the first questions.
Not sure if I'm reading it. It says, should we live together and the surrogate in a personal meeting at least once is important or just via Skype? Well, you wouldn't, I'm not sure if you mean you should live with the surrogate. No, you wouldn't want to do that. Personal meeting, I mean, the first time you will meet the surrogate will be via Skype. Usually it's kind of part of the match call. You won't match with her until that's gone forward. A lot of people like to try and meet them in person at least once during the journey prior to the pregnancy, and whether that be at maybe the first transfer or maybe the ultrasound week 16 to 20 of the pregnancy, so that you can actually connect in person, meet her family and her friends and get an idea of her house, etc. But the first meeting, you can do it in person, but most people just do it via Skype and have a long Skype call to go over many things, questions, etc. about the process. Someone asked if we're able to share the slides of today's presentation afterwards. Yes, we'll be emailing everyone who's on this webinar a copy of the whole presentation, both the slideshow as well as the actual presentation. So if the pregnancy is my pregnancy and I want to terminate or abort the baby because of some disability, I can decide, right? So this is a tough question. I'll just go over it how I usually go over it. So when you would assign with Circle, there's a certain questionnaire you fill out that asks these specific questions of when you'd want to terminate or not. The surrogate gets asked the same exact questions, and we match you with someone who has the same exact feelings on termination and abortion. It'll also be put into your contract with the surrogate that you have these decision-making rights. From a 100% legal perspective, that contract provision probably doesn't have power, and the surrogate will always have the right to change her mind just based on the U.S. constitutional rights to choose, the right to terminate. It's never happened in our history. It's why we do our very thorough screening. If it were to happen, she would be in violation of the contract and there'd be certain penalties. But even though you're contracting with someone for those rights, she still will have the right to change her mind. But again, it's something you shouldn't worry about. It's why we do our very thorough screens. And on the few occasions where these issues have arisen, the surrogates have done whatever the intended parents wish. Is it often preferred from the surrogate for the couple to be married? Not really. I mean, we match single intended parents. We also match a lot of unmarried couples, both heterosexual and same-sex. So, maybe on a few occasions surrogates will have that preference, but it's not very common. I've never had an issue with that. How long after the birth do we need to stay in the U.S.? This is partially dependent on how quick the child is discharged from the hospital, but I would say on average about 2 to 4 weeks from discharge from the hospital. If you need to make that trip to the consulate, it obviously can potentially be a little extended depending on where the consulate is and when you get an appointment. But usually the legal work in the passport, U.S. passport, is wrapped up within that first 2 weeks. So it's whenever you're ready. Do you give advice or can advise on loans for those of us who need financial assistance? We wouldn't know from a Norwegian perspective or a Swedish perspective. We offer financing here, but it's only for U.S. residents. That it's through a financing company that makes that requirement. But a lot of people have always, typically in both Norway and Sweden, have either got the loan based on equity in their home or things like that, but I'm not 100% sure. So it would probably be something you need to seek out on your own in Norway. What happens if I get a disabled child and I wanted a healthy one? Well, there's no kind of guarantee on health. You can do a lot of screening at the embryo stage. There's what's called PGD in the United States or around the world, which is kind of genetic testing and embryonic testing to make sure there's no disabilities and other diseases, etc., that can be passed on. It's an extra charge with the IVF clinics, but they all have it available. And that way you can kind of take out that chance of a disabled, any disability or any long-term illness, things like that.
Okay, those are the only questions we have right now. Oh, we got another one.
All right, so there's a question about this Norwegian citizenship, how a child becomes Norwegian, and does it make a difference if a spouse is American? The biggest positive when you have one U.S. and one non-U.S. living abroad is the U.S. Parent can actually purchase health insurance for the child in the U.S. based on his U.S. residence, so you don't have to worry about insurance and coverage for the child. From a citizenship standpoint, I'm not 100% sure on how it happens, and maybe Christian can speak on how he registered the child and how he was able to get Norwegian citizenship and passports. But from my very limited experience with intended parents, the process they've started is in the U.S. At the consulate doing a blood test, which deems the Norwegian parent the parent, and then doing a registration process upon returning home. I don't know if, Christian, you want to hit on it quick on how you were able to establish Norwegian citizenship for the children.
Yeah, we were sort of pretty. I mean, we didn't really know our way around, but the one thing we registered was that the way the law works for them, I'm aware in Norway, is what the government looks at is basically, for at least for same-sex couples, the person who gave birth will always be regarded as the mother. So what we did was basically to make sure that we had a birth certificate with the surrogate on, as well as the biological father on. And what I can't really address is what happens if the biological father is a foreign citizen. I suppose that would depend on if the couple is married or not. As long as the parent is a Norwegian national or married to a Norwegian national, the child will automatically be entitled to Norwegian citizenship. So the problem begins, as far as I've heard, when you try to sort of manipulate the birth certificate, say trying to put two males on, because then you can kind of confuse the Norwegian system. The Norwegian government wants to know who gave birth, because later on, when you start the adoption process, if that's what they're going to do, at least for couples, they will want to reach out, not to the biological mother, but they will want to reach out to the mother, which is the person who gave birth. So for the actual adoption process, you need to make sure that there's an alignment on the birth certificate between the person giving birth and the name that's on the papers. As long as sort of you get this match right, the process itself is pretty straightforward. And like I said, I wouldn't know what happens if a couple of people who aren't married, where one is the biological father but isn't a Norwegian national. In that case, I don't know what happens. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, that's great.
There's a question of whether gender can be chosen. That the PGD process that I talked about that does all these genetic testing is also can be used for gender selection as well in the U.S. If something goes wrong under the birth prematurely, does the insurance cover the stay at a hospital? Again, this is going to depend on a lot of things, which program you're in, whether you purchase insurance externally to cover the child, or you're in a program where the surrogate insurance is supposed to cover. There's no 100% guarantees, but we've had a lot of success in the past getting coverage. Also, currently, what we're trying to work on with our new healthcare law in the United States requires all U.S. citizens to have health insurance, and we have seen some states have the ability to purchase insurance for the child from date of birth that will cover the hospital stay. So we can talk more about that specifically if we were to have a consultation, but there's usually ways to protect yourself with some type of insurance in place for the child or children. There's a question specifically to Christian. Christian, first, does your child have dual nationality, both U.S. and Norwegian?
Yeah, they do. They are American, Norwegian, and they have an American Social Security number as well as a Norwegian one.
Okay. And there's no issues. Does Norway still only allow single citizenship, or do they allow dual now?
Yeah, normally we'd have to make a choice at 18.
After 18.
And maybe they might have changed the laws by then, but now they have dual citizenship.
Okay. Thank you. There's some rather specific questions down the line. It's probably better to answer these on a consultation or just a quick phone call because they're more specific. So you can email them directly to Bruce and we can respond to them at bhale@circlesurrogacy.com. And I think that should be it. Again, if you have other questions that we didn't get to answer today, feel free to reach out directly to Bruce or anyone really here at Circle. Just let them know you were on the webinar and there were some more questions you had that you wanted answered. And feel free to sign up for a consultation if you'd rather have a more in-depth presentation. As I said earlier, we'll be in Norway most likely in May or June, and usually we're there in November as well. So if you're not ready at the moment, but you'd like to meet in person, we'll definitely be there sometime in the near future, as well as other places in Europe too. That if you're not ready when we're there, in Norway and Sweden. We're in London a lot. We're in Paris. We're in Copenhagen this year, I believe, and Amsterdam as well.
Yeah, you can go to our website, circlesurrogacy.com, and click on the events button to keep track of where we're going to be next. So like Dean said, that about wraps it up. I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight, and especially thank Christian for sharing his experience, which was very helpful. So with that, we'll say goodnight, and thanks again for attending.